Well, Diane, I'd like to talk with you a little bit about human sexuality, and especially from the aspect of gender differences. People know you, I think, as a wonderful artist and so on, but I'm wondering what your qualifications are to speak about this particular topic.
Well, golly. Gender sexuality, I guess I fall into one of two.
That's right.
Female, does that
I
count?
thought it would be good to have a woman on the program to discuss this, since we might get the male and female viewpoint. Also, I happen to be unmarried myself, and you happen to be married with children.
With children.
Right. So you bring another perspective to the question that way as well. Also, I chose you because you seem to have a spiritual sense of things. I know you do spiritual direction for many people and do it well. And so I wanted to approach this topic not just in terms of techniques or psychological analyses, but also in terms of Christian outlooks and what it means for us spiritually in our spiritual growth and development. So let's talk a little. You can talk about sexuality in a lot of different ways. You can talk about it in genital terms. You can talk about it in terms of married life. You can do it in terms of interpersonal relationships, love. You could talk about it, whether it's seen as fundamentally valuable, good, or seen in a negative light. But I want to focus in this program on the gender question, sexuality as gender. And that begins to raise questions about male and female relationships, how we see the world differently, and so on. No, there's been a time when you really couldn't have this kind of conversation with a lot of women, strong radical feminists, for example, because any talk of gender differences were put down. I remember having a discussion with Rosemary Ruther one time, the well-known feminist theologian, and suggested that maybe the fact that she had had a baby and given birth would influence her outlook on God, and she, in very non-genteel language, let me know that she didn't think much of that.
Ooh.
She wasn't willing to discuss that kind of thing. She thought that was a bunch of baloney, this business of gender differences along that line. So you got right away, you got people who don't want to talk about that. I hope personally that you're not one of those, because we could have a very short program.
We would. No.
You're willing to talk about it.
I am.
Gender differences,
Sure.
yeah.
Oh,
in other words, you see the fact that men and women see things differently or behave differently and so on.
Oh, absolutely.
Good.
But that's good.
Yeah.
That's not a negative.
Gives a zest to life. Of course, what the feminists always worried about is that if you talk gender differences, then women were going to end up losing. They would always be defined over against the males who were doing all the talking, and they would end up looking bad. You know, so the typical thing was, well, men are rational and women are emotional, and therefore they don't think clearly. That was the general put down, wasn't it? So you can understand why feminists did not want to talk a lot about gender differences, because it became a stereotypical way of putting women in a bad light. But I think we can overcome that, don't you?
Oh, I sure do. And I also think that thinking styles necessarily are wonderful things when you talk about having a conversation. Thinking styles between men and women usually contribute to a real richness in conversation. For instance, men tend to think more focused. Women think more diffuse. By thinking more diffused, it doesn't mean that they're scattered. It means that usually there are 4 or 5 thoughts going on at the same time. And when that's put together in a conversation, it isn't two people battling to find some common ground, but it's it seems to contribute to the whole essence of what's being talked about.
Yeah, and it gives, as you said, a richness, right?
Right. It does.
And often an excitement or a zest or a chemistry even, if one's open to the differences.
Yes.
Oh.
If one's open to the differences.
One of the ways that gets played out in and this is, I take this from, I'm very influenced by Carol Gilligan's book, In a Different Voice.
Right. It's a good book.
Yes, it is. And she has gotten some of her material from other scholars. I know that. She's dependent upon others. But she has popularized a lot of it in her book, In a Different Voice. And she points out how men and women make moral decisions differently, or just their decisions in everyday life. And I suppose the common example of that is when a husband would ask his wife, well, where do you want to go for dinner? And in answering that question, the wife often has many considerations in her mind. That is, well, where do the children want to go? And what kind of food do they want to eat? And how do we satisfy all the different children? She's probably also asking herself, well, where does he, her husband, want to go? And how does she blend all of that and put it all together? And she's taking time to work all this out in her own mind in giving a contextual kind of response to what seems to be a simple question, where do you go to eat? And he's sitting there thinking, why can't you make up your mind? Where do you want to go? That's where I want to take you.
But see, she's been socialized to listen to someone else first, especially if she was the good girl when she grew up and she read mom's concerns and dad's concerns before she addressed her own. She really does feel confused when somebody says, well, where do you want to go to dinner? She's not used to addressing her own wants first. She's used to acclimating herself to what someone else wants. And that's where some of the social patterning comes in early on. One thing I find very interesting with women is educated women will often say, if they're giving a strong opinion about something in response to something a speaker said, they may say, well, it may be only me, but, well, I don't know if this is right, but they qualify before they give an opinion very often rather than just stating what they feel and how they feel about it. I found it interesting. Professionally, I work at a grade school, Jesu grade school, 2 days a week, counseling children, and I also work as an assistant professor at medical college. And in working with both children and adults, the gender difference comes out very strongly early on. I was working with 5th grade students last year, and they were into discussing what they didn't like and who they didn't like, and I wanted to show them that they had various facets of themselves. And I had them separated, and I asked the girls, said, I'd like you to name something you like about yourself and something you dislike about yourself. And they were very quick to describe what they disliked about themselves. Oh, they went on. And then I said, well, the object is, what do you like about yourself? And they had a very difficult time. They would come up with something.
How old are these kids?
They're 10.
10.
I did the same.
What grade are you in?
5th.
5th grade, yeah.
I did the same thing with the boys. The boys immediately could say what they liked about themselves. They liked to bat, or they were a good team person, or they were a good sport. And they had a very difficult time finding what they disliked about themselves. So there's a lot of social patterning about not being able to come out strongly and decisively by age 10. And I've done that exercise repeatedly with 9 and 10-year-olds, and the results are pretty consistent, only getting worse as they get older.
Getting worse. That's really frightening, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
No. It raises the whole question about these gender differences and whether they are biologically based or whether they are culturally induced, and you get a great debate about that. I noticed that even Rosemary Ruth, who I mentioned before, strong feminist, is willing to admit certain biological differences. At least she entertains those, and that in the brain makeup there are certain relationships that women are able to make more easily than men do, which makes their thinking more contextual. You use the word diffuse. I might use the word contextual, relationally thinking, considering many viewpoints and many factors in making moral decisions. Well, anyway, I my own sense of reading the literature is that you get these days a continuing debate for sure, but you get a little more willingness to admit some biological differences, I think, and that becomes, I think, dangerous in the minds of many feminists to talk that way, and I understand that. However, you also get this kind of popular literature that says, well, we've tried hard to socialize our little girls in certain educated circles to play with many things besides dolls, or to take hold of themselves or see themselves in a good way, and all of this, and that it often has not been all that successful. And so, of course, you could say, well, there's other larger cultural messages that you're fighting against, and that's why you can't accomplish that.
But that is speaking to androgyny, and a lot of times on a playground, excuse me, androgyny would say that if a boy feels badly, cry, because you get the feeling out. Do you know what happens on a playground if a boy cries every time he feels badly? When we talk about androgyny, we usually talk about encouraging a girl to play baseball, and if we do it both ways, how do we encourage a little boy to vent feelings without being made fun of? We have a long way to go as far as encouraging and breaking down the sexual differences that go on, especially before high school.
Yes. But on the other hand, we have to start to find some way to get perspective on all of this, I suppose, from our Christian outlook, and to deal with the stereotypical problems as you suggested. I mean, the problem again is if you stereotype people and you say all men are like this and all women are like this, then you got a problem, because what we're forcing individuals is to fit into certain patterns. Mm-hmm. So if you tell men you're supposed to be logical, rational, strong, and not cry, not show your emotions, be independent, be autonomous, then we're forcing men to act in that way, where some men don't fit into that mold.
That's true.
And then what happens is men try to fit into the mold, and if they can't, they feel bad, or they feel like they're weird, or aren't acceptable, and so on. And you get the same thing with women. So the great problem is sort of a Procrustean bed, where you force people into the particular parameters that you've set up, and then that hurts individuals. So it strikes me that part of one of our Christian outlooks on all of that is to remember the uniqueness of each person. Mm-hmm. That every person is called by name by God, mm-hmm. and that they have their own unique qualities and distinctive characteristics, and that fundamentally we have to learn to respect that. I think what we're talking about here is sort of statistical studies. I'm sure you'd find some girls 10 years old who would list their good qualities and very well. I mean, and be at ease with that. And some boys who would be more self-critical, to use your own example. Mm-hmm. So we can't, what we're talking about, when you talk sexual gender differences, you're talking sort of statistical studies or general trends, without, on the other hand, saying that people can't have characteristics of the other side. Mm-hmm. I think that's a very important way to begin to approach it, and our Christian faith would remind us of that. Don't put people in pigeonholes. Give them space to move around. I just think that even happens in marriages, I think. Where there's certain cultural expectations that people bring to marriages, and, I mean, the partner might not fit that.
Absolutely.
Or the partner might grow out of it, might have been in that mold at one time, or might grow out of it.
That's what happens even more often. It seems that when they married in their 20s or early 20s, they had picked up a value system based on how they grew up, and they decided that women are supposed to be this way and men are supposed to be this way, and as they grew away from that image of themselves, and when they did, it wasn't always a real comfortable thing for their partner, and it becomes a very difficult adjustment, especially through the 30s, which is for women, the most stressful time of life.
30s, huh?
Absolutely. During the 30s, they are dealing with a disillusionment. Most people become disillusioned with any kind of a relationship, and that usually comes about in the 30s. Their children have spanned adolescence to early childhood as a rule, so they are dealing with the burgeoning problems of adolescence, but they're also handling little ones. They are trying to find out who this self is that has been so task-oriented for 10 years and has not probably had a lot of time to develop as a sense of self. They are meeting with increased expectations and decreased energy, just because there are so many demands on their time. And if there is pressure to go back to school to resume something that they began, the pressure would be most felt in the 30s, because you begin to look at how many years you have left. Joseph Campbell has said something about the marriage relationship in terms of dividing it into two halves, that the first half, which I think is epitomized by the 30s, late 20s, into the early 40s, as a task-oriented relationship, that one falls in love You get married, but then you buy the house, you find the jobs, you have the babies, you pay for the furniture, you learn how to get along with in-laws, you readjust to your parents as equals rather than as authority figures, you try to form your own value system spiritually, and the tasks are incredible. For a man at work, his 30s are very decisive years for him. When one hits the 40s and into the 50s, the children pretty much have been raised.
Talking men now?
Both.
Okay.
Both. The tasks of can I make it have been accomplished for the most part, and often two people look at each other after 20 years of getting the job done and say, who are we as relationship? And the second half of marriage is really much more about relationships than divvying up tasks.
Your own sense is that men and women approach a lot of this in different ways again. If we're talking about the gender, the women experience their 30s in a different way than men would.
Yes.
My own perception would be that more of the crises come to men in their 40s.
Right, it does. 40s
50s,
are more crisis years.
Yeah, when some of when men sort of arrive at the position of saying, I'm not going to be as great as I thought I was going to be, I'm not going to move ahead, I'm not all that satisfied with the job, and there's a process of getting one's dreams in line with the reality of one's life.
Yes.
It often sets up a very a searching mode. How do I rekindle what I had before? How do I restart the process? And we get the well-known by now midlife crises growing out of that. Often thought that it's a sexual problem primarily. My sense has been that it's not. It's primarily a crisis of limitations, of facing one's limitations. And the sexual activity becomes a symbol of that, which is always the case with sexual activity. It's always symbolic. Here it speaks about searching to enliven a previous dream or to bring back some zest that one has lost, some chemistry.
There is, he was a client a few years back, and he said, the odd thing is, I'm 70 years old, but my insides still feel 28. Nothing happens way down deep on the inside, that you still have all the dreams you always had. The problem is your physical energy starts to dissipate, and that's very painful for both sexes, when all the dreams that they always had, they still have, yet something inside says, you may want to read a 300-page book until midnight, but I'm tired, and it may be 8 o'clock, but I'm finished. And that becomes sad.
Yes.
It really does, for both sexes.
And again, we have to allow people to sort of develop along their own path, don't we? Because, we don't want to create midlife crises for men and say you're supposed to have a crisis in your 40s, or women are supposed to be unhappy in their 30s. I mean, I think that's what happens with this kind of talk. It gets to be another cultural stereotype floating around, and we almost end up, I think, creating these things. That's why I'm back to my primary point is we got to respect the uniqueness of both men and women. However, we also can't be involved in a situation where you can't say anything universally. I mean, there are statistical studies and so on that corroborate the idea that there are differences between the sexes, and whether they're culturally induced or whether they're biologically based, we have to end up dealing constructively with those. So let's take the example. I mean, a woman in her 30s who is feeling those things, her husband has to have certain sensitivity, doesn't he? He has to be attuned to that. He has to be responsive to what's going on with her at this time. Maybe encourage her. She wants to go back to school, to encourage that or facilitate it or give her the opportunity, or various ways that he ought to be supportive in the midst of that.
The problem is he's on his own fast track in the 30s, and it's very difficult sometimes to be there for another person when you're in a whirlwind yourself. But yes, if it's possible, it's a wonderful thing for two people to be able to do. That's one of the most important facets of spending alone time together for people who are married or in any kind of a relationship. I usually encourage people to take breakfast time out on Saturday mornings or some other time, because then you can focus on relationship and not on tasks.
I like to suggest a lot of times that people take walks after dinner.
Yes.
Get away from the kids, get out of the house, let the teenage kids do the dishes. If if you can manage that and get your chance to talk and be together and so on, and explore some of these different outlooks. I think what we're talking about is dialogue as a tool. Again, part of our Christian outlook would be that we ought to learn from one another, that we ought to be willing to listen. We ought to be people who have a fundamental respect for the other person and believe that they can broaden our horizons, that they can help us see things in a different way.
That part is key. How much a person is willing to see things in a different way. Oftentimes dialogue means I'm going to sell you with my point.
Yeah, well, this is not true dialogue, is it? That's argumentation or something else.
In love
Manipulation,
relationships.
probably.
Mm-hmm. But
Yeah.
in love relationships, there's an awful lot at stake, usually the fear of rejection. And that usually plays into lots of conversations that might seem appropriate, but there's something much more hidden and a much deeper agenda involved.
Yeah, again, from our Christian perspective, that we want to push this, don't we, this dialogue thing. We want to say that's a good way of doing it, and what we've got to do is learn to listen, to hear the emotional tone that goes with the words and so on.
Yes, it is. I think it's important to know that when you come from strengths in dialogue, you need to recognize that that can be manipulative.
Well, I was thinking about other particular ways in which these gender differences get worked out. Let's talk about careers for a minute. I mean, you have your own career and your husband has his, and you have to work that out. I notice in dealing with the young people, it's a big question these days. College-educated women who think they're going to have their own careers, their own jobs. They want to pursue that. They don't want to give all that up. I think there was an earlier generation where women thought, well, they did give it up. They gave it up to get married, and they wouldn't work outside the home. They would work full-time in the home, and so on. We're seeing a lot of middle-aged women who are not satisfied with that, who want to do something else. That's creating a lot of our problems. Mm-hmm. Another way it works itself out is that in terms of economics, that so often it's the men who have the better jobs, higher-paying jobs, I should put it that way, and therefore much of the moving that goes about is based on the husband's chance to earn more money. Mm-hmm. And therefore the women are often in a position of saying, yeah, I'll give up my job or my career and move with you. Often it's a joint decision. I remember a couple having all kinds of trouble. I had their wedding, and we had talked about this ahead of time, and they dialogued, and the husband would get a job offer that he could make $10,000 more, and she'd say, yeah, I'll give up my job and move. They did that twice, and by the end of that, she's saying, I'm sick of this. I can't stand it. And the worst thing is I agreed to each move. Mm-hmm. And now I'm terribly unhappy because I'm the one who always has to give up. Mm-hmm. So this career thing really has built-in problems.
And that relates itself sexually very often.
You want to explain that?
Yes. That sexuality is so much more than a sexual act, yet the sexual act is the symbol of what a person brings in their entire life together. And if there are angers that aren't discussed, they get played out sexually in all sorts of ways. I'll say yes, but I really mean no. One more time where you get your way. It can be a very dangerous and vulnerable place to enact parts of one's marriage that have nothing to do with the sexual part,
mm-hmm.
yet we're a whole person.
Yes, what it reminds us of is that sexuality is a dimension of life, isn't it? We are bodily creatures. We're made male and female by the Creator, and we live and move and act as males and females in our world. We relate to one another as men or as women, and mm-hmm. That begins to pervade our whole being. We're sexual creatures all the time. And the genital sexuality is one aspect of that. But we got to remember that we're always relating with these gender differences. And any question, whether it's how we converse, whether it's the way we make decisions or reason, as you brought up early on, the way we deal with careers, always that's going to play a part in it. So sexuality is a word that describes is a very broad word here. It's an integral part of human nature. We see it as essentially good and given to us by God from the Creator. We're threatened by all the distortions that you've brought out. It's always in danger of getting out of control, I suppose, in one way or another, of bringing contradictions into our sexual life. But we also believe that that's healed by Christ, that Christ's grace gives us a chance to transcend those problems. So we don't want to say that people are just fated to be messed up. I want to tell this young couple, well, let's work this out. Let's think of other priorities. Maybe the next time it's time to move, you're not going to move. Even though you can make $5,000 more and so on, but the husband's going to and the wife going to decide we're not going to move because there's other values. We want the kids to stay in this school. The wife likes her job, and now she can keep it. So I think there's a broader way of looking at this, that maybe we don't want to just say that the sexual gender differences are always going to divide us or make life difficult or be uncontrollable in some way. We want to say in our Christian outlook that there's ways to manage this through dialogue, through compromise, and so on.
We civilize each other, I think, both male and female, in terms
That's a nice phrase.
Yeah, it's well, I do think that. That's if everyone thought male or if everyone thought female, we would not complement each other. And to me, a good relationship is like a dance. Sometimes one person takes the lead and sometimes another person takes the lead. And when we talk about different age stages of life, there might be a time in life where it's much more crucial for the woman and for the children to have their needs met than for his career needs to be met. But it's like a dance. One needs to look at the whole of life, not just this situation. But that's what adds such interest.
Yeah, and I think you've made that point well, and it's a terribly important one. I like your metaphors there, like the dance. One can take the initiative at one point, another time, and that we want to see the gender differences as finally being fruitful, as being exciting, as we learn from one another. We can converse as men and women and enter each other's world as you allow me into yours, and to see life from your viewpoint. And I think those gender differences then can really be constructive, and they don't have to be stereotypical, and have to put people down, but we can let them, as the Creator intended, making us male and female, and to be fruitful.